the entire Pacific Northwest region, especially here for Cheney and Spokane. My name is Patrick Carnahan. Charlie Hamilton and I are the co-executive directors of All Aboard Washington. We've both been involved with the organization for a couple of years now, but we couldn't be happier to be involved right now because we know that there's so much going on at so many different levels of government, whether at the federal level or the local level, just in terms of interest in better transportation services across the entire country. So that's why we're here. We're on what we like to call the train track across the state. We wanted to give this a try last year, but unfortunately with the pandemic, there were just a lot of things that we weren't able to do. So we're glad to be here in Cheney today to get this conversation started. Our 2021 train trek is bringing us across the Northwest. We started out last Thursday over in the Puget Sound. We had a couple meetings in Everett and Edmonds. We then continued on to Leavenworth and Wenatchee, talked with people along the existing Empire Builder route between Seattle and Spokane. Then we made our way down to the Yakima Valley, spent the day talking with people in Yakima, Toppenish, and the Tri-Cities. Including Representative Matt Banky from the 8th District. He was there and he's really interested in rail. He's a part of the Washington State Legislative Rail Caucus. And then we made our way on to Walla Walla and Lewiston, had some great conversations there, and made our way on to Montana. We actually participated in what is called the Pacific Northwest Economic Region Summit. It's a large, PNWER as it's referred to, is a large organization consisting of representatives, businesses, and other groups from across the Northwestern United States and Western Canada. There were people there from 6 Canadian provinces and 5 US states, all representing kind of the Northwest corner of North America. And people there were very excited about rail. Charlie and I actually participated in a rail forum. We talked about some rail issues going on in the Northwest and our efforts to collaborate with colleagues, not just in Washington, but really across the entire Northwest. So that was really exciting. And now we're on our way back home. We had a meeting yesterday in Spokane at the airport, had some great participation from someone from the city of Spokane, as well as from Spokane Transit. And here we are today in Cheney. Later on this afternoon, we'll be in Ritzville, talking with some people there. Fun fact, did you know that Ritzville actually has an Amtrak committee within its city council? They're really crazy about Amtrak service, and we know that there's going to be some really exciting discussions there that we're really looking forward to. I know, yeah, we gotta have a good midway stop, and absolutely, and we think Cheney as well with Eastern Washington University offers a lot of great opportunities. So totally, it's and that's exactly why we're here. We want to talk about that. And finally, tomorrow we will be in Ellensburg, and we'll be wrapping it up with our All Aboard Washington annual picnic in Salem. So it's a big trip, but we're really glad to be doing it, and we're really glad to be here today to talk about what's going on with rail. And it wouldn't be possible without all of our generous sponsors, including the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority. I was talking with some of you earlier. Someone that we know quite closely, Dave Strohmeyer, is a county commissioner in Missoula County, Montana, and he spearheaded efforts last year to create a new organization on the county level in Montana called the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority. It's basically a group of counties along the southern tier of Montana whose goal is to restore passenger rail service through uniting the efforts of all the counties along the line to help fund local station improvements, track improvements, things like that, and to show that there's a coalition of counties and cities along the southern tier of Montana that wants to have passenger rail service. So we're really honored to be working with them and to have such good connections with Dave and all the people at BSPRA, and we're thankful for their support of the train trek. And we're also quite thankful to all of the individuals who have donated to All Aboard Washington to make it possible. Everyone listed on the screen, some of our members and some people who have heard about what we've been doing and really believe in the vision of a better connected Washington. So for everyone here, whether you're a member, whether you're a donor or a volunteer, or whether you just want to help make things better, we appreciate your support, and we're thankful for you to be here today to join in on this conversation. So who is All Aboard? For some of you are members or former members, and for those of you who may not know too much about us, we've been around for a while. Passenger rail advocacy efforts have been around particularly since the late 1950s and 1960s. All Aboard Washington was founded a little over 40 years ago, and we've been kind of the primary champions of better passenger rail services in the Northwest. And we're particularly trying to make connections to freight. We know that that's an important issue that has to be always connected with it. We're a nonprofit group consisting of individuals, businesses, and other nonprofit groups who have a goal of trying to make transportation services better in the Northwest, particularly rail services. We're a small organization, but Charlie and I are, and our president Kathy here, and one of our board members, Warren, we're all so happy to be involved with this right now because we know that there's so much going on. It's just an incredibly exciting time for passenger rail, with just completely unprecedented opportunities. So that's why we're here. We want to talk about it. First of all, we'll talk about what are our 3 E's, kind of our guiding principles, and how do they connect with transportation. Number 2, we'll talk about some of our current efforts. In particular, we'll be focusing on the restoration of daytime passenger train service between Seattle and Spokane via the Yakima and Kittitas valleys. I'll also have a brief mention about kind of what it would take to get train service to Cheney. And finally, how you can help, what you can do as members of your community or as representatives, as working in the media, whatever your role is, what can you do to help support our mission and achieve a better, more equitable passenger rail system for the entirety of Washington State and the entirety of the Pacific Northwest. Yes.
I would like to know how much progress you've made. I'm gonna invest my time and work. I don't know. I don't know. How did you gain? What have you gained? Have you been able to make them?
Absolutely, yeah. And that is something I'll talk about a little bit during the presentation, but definitely over the past couple of years, we have been able to make an impact. We have made progress, and we see that there's even more opportunities for progress than when I first joined the organization just a couple of years ago. So definitely that's something we'll talk about. And there's a lot of stuff, kind of dating back historically with All Aboard Washington. All Aboard Washington was instrumental in the creation of the Olympia Lacey Amtrak station in the late 1980s, early 1990s, as well as our former executive director, Lloyd Flem, was really involved in the startup of the Amtrak Cascade service, serving the Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, Eugene, Oregon corridor. We've been around, we've been doing a lot, and we've made progress recently as well. So definitely happy to talk about that, because I mean that's what it's all about, is we have to be making a difference. It's not just talk, it's action. It's how do we make things happen? So happy to discuss that. So kind of as we start our discussion today, it's good to kind of frame it around this simple question: what is world-class transportation? I think when you ask anybody, hey, what's good transportation? What's cool transportation? A lot of times we think of trains. Maybe it's the Sound Transit light rail system that's being built in Seattle. Maybe it's the Shinkansen bullet train in Japan, which I've had the opportunity to ride. Goes almost 200 miles an hour. Maybe it's some of these futuristic technologies that we hear about, like maglev or hyperloop, things like that. Things that go super fast, faster than a plane. A lot of times when we think about world-class transportation, there's kind of this notion based on what we see from around the world that it's rail. Whether it's a good streetcar network, whether it's good intercity trains, something like that. It's almost always involving trains. And we at All Aboard Washington have worked with trains for a long time. We've been, primary advocates for trains in Washington State for a long time. But what we've recognized, over the years, and what we see, as we have discussions with people all across the region, is that it's more than just trains. There's a lot that goes into making a truly world-class transportation network. If we think about it, you have to be able to walk out of your house, and where are you going? Where, is it somewhere across the state? Is it somewhere across town? And you have to have a multiplicity of options, whether it's sidewalks, whether it's bike lanes, whether it's a good local bus, whether it's a really good connecting intercity bus, or maybe it's a train of some sort. There's all sorts of different modes that have to be considered. And we need to remember, as we're talking about world-class transportation, is that it's not just as simple as rail. When it gets down to, if we want to boil it down to a really simple question, it is it reasonably easy to get from here to there? And if we ask that question in most of Eastern Washington, we know the answer. It is not easy to get places without depending on your car. There are not a lot of good options. Charlie and I did a routing of what it would take to get, for example, from Seattle to Cle Elum. You know, that's just down I-90. It should take less than 2 hours, right? That's what it takes by car. Well, what Apple Maps was suggesting based on the existing transit options was a 19-hour and 49-minute ride on the Empire Builder to Wenatchee, spending the night in Wenatchee, then taking a bus to Ellensburg, waiting a couple more hours in Ellensburg, and then finally making it to Cle Elum via another bus. It's just not a very well-connected system. And it takes almost an entire day to get where you want to go. Similarly, I did a routing from Spokane to Walla Walla, same side of the state. It shouldn't be that hard, right? Well, what it suggested there was a bus to go down to Oregon, get off in, I think, Hermiston or Umatilla, Oregon, wait a couple hours, then take a bus to Pendleton, wait a couple hours, then finally make it up to Walla Walla. I literally had to leave the state in order to get somewhere within my own state. It's unbelievable. And I think that's something we all recognize right now, that our transportation network, really across the entire state, whether it's on the west side or the east side, is just woefully inefficient. It's woefully insufficient for the needs that we have. The reality today is if you want to get anywhere, you pretty much have two options. Number one, buy a car, maintain the car, pay for insurance, pay to keep your license, pay to register your car, and then if it's the summer, you get the joys of traffic and construction, and if it's the winter, maybe you have to deal with a pass closure. Or maybe you have to shell out an absolute ton of money to get anywhere other than Seattle. I was looking at a plane ticket from Yakima to Spokane, and what I found was that it was going to be somewhere along the lines of $240 for a one-way from Yakima to Spokane via Seattle. It's just ridiculous. Yay, mailbag, $240. Yeah. Doesn't that make you look forward to your next trip? Doesn't that make you look forward to visiting people, getting places where you need to go when you have to deal with all that hassle? And we know that
the things that Seattle and Portland have to offer. But getting there is just too difficult, especially for senior citizens who don't want to go on, through the pass and over this and down this way, and then get on our top.
Absolutely. No, you're completely right about that. And I have a very personal connection with that as well. A very, very close family friend of ours who I consider to be my grandmother. She talks all the time about how difficult it is to drive over in the Puget Sound area. She lives in Kitsap County, where I grew up. And she has a son who lives in Stanwood. So, that would mean, taking the ferry over to Edmonds and then driving up from there, or driving all the way down to Tacoma and then up through Seattle. And she talks about just how terrifying it is now, as someone who's a little older with a little bit slower reaction time, who's having vision problems, to try to get around when there are essentially no other options than to get in your car. That's true with local transportation, and that's true with crossing the mountains as well. One of our board members, Gary Wirt, lives in Yakima. He worked for the FAA for a number of years, and he would absolutely love to see better train service. And he knows, from his own experience, him and his wife, as well as people he knows in Yakima, that it is impossible to try to cross the mountains almost any time of the year. You're gambling on traffic or construction during the summer, or you're gambling on sliding off the road or encountering a pass closure in the winter. It's just impossible. And we know that these are some very serious issues that have been around for a long time. A couple of trains which used to better serve the region have been gradually discontinued over the years. The North Coast Limited, which provided kind of a second alternative train to the Empire Builder, was discontinued in 1979, and then in 1981, the train that was left, the Empire Builder, was rerouted over Stampede Pass away from the Yakima Valley, meaning that Yakima Valley lost a lot of service. So if anyone trying to get from Spokane to Yakima or Ellensburg via train, that was no longer an option. And people say, okay, yeah, well then it's Greyhound's good, right? Well, we've all been hearing what's been happening with Greyhound. Their Bolt Bus brand collapsed last year as a result of the pandemic, and their service has declined across the entire country. They've shut down service in most of Canada. They've taken away a lot of their station facilities in North America. I know that they've stopped serving the Portland bus station. Now they just pick you up from a curb. We know airport charter buses are costly, whether you're taking an airport shuttle, to Spokane or any one of the shuttles to SeaTac. That if you can even get one of those, those are incredibly expensive. Flights to anywhere but the biggest airports are usually very expensive, and a lot of times, they don't offer direct routing of any sort. And then finally, we know that there are tons of communities which are along Amtrak lines right now that don't have any service. That includes Cheney, that includes Ritzville, Connell. So there are tons of communities that are simply disconnected from any option other than driving. And we know that the pandemic made things worse. We understand that the Empire Builder service was cut to 3 days a week during the pandemic. Amtrak Cascades over on the west side of the mountains was running 4 times a day between Seattle and Portland, 2 times a day between Portland and Eugene, and 2 times a day between Seattle and Vancouver. All the service north of Seattle was shut down, and all of the trains between Seattle and Eugene, except for one, were canceled. The Coast Starlight, which goes down from Seattle to Portland and Los Angeles, was also, along with the Empire Builder, cut to 3 days a week. So that made things tough for a lot of people who had to travel and who have no options. I mean, think about a freighter. How hard is it to find options from a freighter, or many of the communities across Montana. So this affected people all across the country, and particularly here in the Northwest, and particularly our small communities that really depend on Amtrak as a lifeline. Thankfully, that's gotten better. We understand that 3 of the trains between Seattle and Portland have been restored. The route between Portland and Eugene is now back to twice a day, and all of the long distance trains, including the Empire Builder, are back to daily service. So at least there is a train once a day in each direction, unlike before. And ridership is recovering. We know that even before the restoration of routes, that a lot of people were itching to get back on the train. There were not only a lot of essential travelers, but people who still wanted to have options. And while car traffic was returning to normal, there was a big delay in the restoration of train service. But thankfully, that's gotten better. And we knew that, before even the restoration of trains, that ridership was beginning to do just as well as, if not outperform, what it was before the pandemic. So, that's really encouraging news. And that leads us into the need for better passenger trains. Why are we talking so much about trains? Aren't trains something from 200 years ago? What's the big deal? Well, what we recognize what we recognize here at All Aboard Washington is that trains are not just an old-fashioned thing. And we recognize that there's a lot more going on with rail now than ever before, because there's this realization of what rail does for our 3 guiding principles: what it does for economic development, what it does for environmental stewardship, and what it does for equity. As my colleague Abe said, what was once old is now new again, because we through a lot of research, through a lot of understanding, through looking at the examples of other countries and just understanding the basic principles of rail, we understand that there's a lot there. So what's in it for economic development? Well, like we were just saying, it's hard to travel when you don't have more than just one option for getting around, and particularly when you're dependent upon driving to get anywhere, and all of the costs and all of the dangers and all of the difficulties associated with that. It's hard to travel. What we understand from Amtrak's own data is that across the entire state of Washington, whether we're talking about Amtrak Cascades or rural routes, that about 11% of train riders in the state would not have chosen to travel if they didn't have the train available to them as an option.
I don't know about others, that the riding a bus means that every hour have to be off and on
And that's what we found here, is that only 10% of people who ride the train would take the bus as an alternative. So really, even though we think about, oh, well, why don't we just put a bus there? It isn't a substitute. There are a lot of ways in which they complement each other, particularly for local service or places where train tracks don't exist. But you're spot on about that. Good as buses are in providing connectivity to places that are further away from the rail network, is not always a substitute. And that makes a big difference. What we understood, just kind of as an aside from the examination of the east-west route, the Seattle to Spokane route, was that the consulting firm only examined trips which would be derived from car travel. So if we're looking at this graph here, according to Amtrak's own data, which includes urban routes and rural routes, like the Empire Builder, like the Amtrak Cascades, a mix of different services, that means that they were really only measuring about 47% of the people who might be driving. They're completely forgetting the 20% of Washingtonians who don't have a driver's license. They're completely forgetting everybody who is choosing to stay at home because they don't have a convenient enough option or an affordable enough option to get where they want to go. And they're not counting people who might not want to deal with being in a cramped bus seat, or they're not counting in people who don't want to shell out $240 for a one-way ticket to Yakima. Which we think is absolutely ridiculous. And it's a particularly big deal for the people who choose not to travel. Think that 11% of train riders in our entire state choose not to travel. And that means lost opportunities for what's going on in our communities, whether that means it's harder for people to get to medical appointments, whether it's harder for people to get to families, or whether it's harder to show what our communities have to offer, whether that's our universities, whether that's wineries, our national and state parks, local parks, things like that. And that has an enormous economic impact that a lot of people don't think about. Experience Washington, the Washington State Tourism Bureau, which was just recently reestablished at the state level, has some great data on the impacts of day trip and overnight visitors. The average day trip visitor spends about $84 in the communities that they visit, and the average overnight visitor spends $366 for every community that they visit. What we understand, based on the ridership potential of the East-West service, that means up to $7 million of extra money going into communities across the state, and that's a particularly big deal for small towns in central and eastern Washington. That means a lot more money staying within our communities because it's easier to get around. Rather than, it's literally easier for me to get on a plane flight to Los Angeles or to Orlando than it is to get to Yakima, so that has an enormous impact. There's also a big impact of equity, and this is an enormous point right here. Fun fact, people live outside of Seattle. I know, right? I swear I must have just heard about this for the first time, but people live outside of Seattle in Washington. We have an amazing state and communities all across the state on both sides of the mountains that are just unbelievably cool to visit. We all know that there's this mindset that transportation only works in urban areas. It only makes sense to build rail or to use rail in big cities. But we know that that's not the case. We know that there are tremendous needs across our entire state, across the entire Northwest, and particularly here in the Inland Empire that really need to be considered. And there's a great example that we have here with the state of Virginia. The state of Virginia, a couple of years ago, was conducting an analysis of relieving traffic congestion on I-95. That's their equivalent of I-5. It goes from Washington, D.C. down south to their state capital of Richmond and further. And they were examining what it would take to fix traffic congestion on about half of that segment between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, about 50 miles or so. What they found was that for building about 50 or so miles of freeway, one lane in each direction, DC to Fredericksburg, would cost somewhere along the lines of $12.5 billion. It would take about 10 years to complete the project. And as soon as those new lanes open, they would be just as jammed as they were before they started the project. So this is something that a lot more states should be looking at. But then they went one step further than that. They asked, what could we do with that money, or maybe even a lot less money, if we invested it somewhere else? And what the Virginia DOT did was they looked at what it would cost to establish passenger rail service across the entire state, improve the existing Washington D.C. oriented commuter rail line, Virginia Rail Express, and expanding the state and long distance Amtrak network across the entire entire state. What they found was that for less than $4 billion, so about a third of the cost of doing this highway project, they could buy a lot of the tracks. All of the tracks highlighted in yellow are tracks that they bought from the private railways. And they could expand commuter service to make it more frequent and better for all the people commuting to Washington, D.C. And they could expand intercity service across literally the entire state, every corner of the state. The majority of the state's population could be within reasonable distance of passenger rail service, all for a third of the cost. And you know, being considerate of the entire region and not just a single commuter corridor in the most urbanized part of the state. And we think that this is exactly what we should be doing here in Washington. And additionally, another great example, you know, kind of connecting into this, are the states of North Carolina and California, both of which leverage bus connections in order to assist with the railway systems. What North Carolina does is they make connecting buses to a lot of their biggest cities outside of their existing rail corridor, but they use them kind of as tests to see what sort of ridership, what sort of interest is there in better rail service. And they found with a couple of their buses that they've been busy enough to justify the restoration of passenger rail service. If we look at the Amtrak Connect Us 2035 map, which we all know has big gaps in this region of the country, one of the things that they considered was the restoration of service to Asheville, North Carolina, thanks in part to Amtrak's connecting bus system, which has proven very successful. Additionally, the state of California invests quite a bit of money in the buses that they have connecting the Amtrak San Joaquin's route to other parts of the state. San Joaquin's is a service connecting Sacramento and the San Francisco Bay Area with the Central Valley of California. And about 25% of the program's budget goes toward buses, but it pays off. 57% of San Joaquin's riders use a bus on at least one end of their trip. And this is especially true in Bakersfield, where a lot of people catch the bus to Los Angeles because there are too many capacity constraints to continue expanding rail service down there. Yes. Yep, right here, San Joaquin connecting this part and this part down here with a few trains a day in each direction. And there, all the green lines that you can see right there are the bus connections connecting Amtrak California's routes with other parts of the state that are not served. So it's really an amazing program that shows, you know, what you can do when you have good bus connections complementing the train. So taking these two big ideas, creating equitable services across the entire state and not just in metro regions, and connecting them with local and intercity bus services to really provide connections that cross county lines, even that cross state lines, to make it easy to get wherever it is you want to go without having to spend way more time than you need, without having to spend way more effort trying to plan it out, look at the map, figure out this connection, run across the street, you know, all of these things. We believe that that's an incredibly important part of equity, making sure that communities of all sizes, small and large, rural and urban, are well connected. And there's a lot of encouraging news going on with that. One bit of news that's really important in particular is that the U.S. Department of Transportation is changing a lot of its criteria for grant applications. Historically, there's been an enormous consideration toward grants where time savings is one of the key criteria. It's usually one of the most heavily weighted. And this is almost always favored highway projects because the consultants with the highway lobby have gotten really good at saying, okay, by adding a lane, like they were talking about doing in Virginia, theoretically, we move X number of cars faster and it saves X number of seconds in the average person's day, which adds up to 20 billion hours saved by doing this lane project for people. And people are now recognizing that this is not true. You look at highway expansions all across the country, and they do nothing for saving time most of the time, particularly in the busiest corridors, and they do nothing for improving equity. They do nothing for improving safety. They discovered, Toronto discovered. Toronto discovered early on that it's impossible to build your way out of congestion, and it's impossible to, with highways, build your way into better mobility. That's exactly why the province of Ontario has invested so much into improving their commuter rail system. And at this point, it's essentially running like a region-wide metro. They're improving frequencies to, I think, somewhere along the lines of, on a lot of lines, like maybe every 30 minutes or more. During the busy times, it's closer to 15 minutes. And that's not just in the busy Toronto, downtown area. That's going well out into the suburbs. That's going well out into regional, connected cities. So that means it's possible to get almost anywhere there. And it's visionary, and it's really equitable. It's making sure that not just urban communities are connected, but so are suburban communities, so are the smaller outlying areas. And that's critically important. And finally, oh, yes, sir.
About 30 years, and I go Seattle really often for my job. And it was very easy to take the train, because I just walked from the headquarters office down to the train station. Up on the train, it was always on time.
Yep.
The Cascades, and get to Seattle. And in the meantime, I'd have 2.5 hours to use my laptop. I went in on a train, you see it on the table, spread out my papers. It was wonderful. And I'd walk up from the train station in Seattle, the office in Seattle, which was great. If I had taken the plane, I would have had to get out of the airport an hour ahead of time. And wait, for security reasons. And then take the plane, it was only 50 minutes, and then skip up to Seattle, but it wasn't enough time really to get up. And it just made a whole lot more sense. And when I got for the Adler, I'd have to wait usually about half an hour, and then get up to Seattle in another 40 minutes or 30 minutes. Like that, and then walk on the bus stop to the Seattle office, which was about as far as when I got off at the King Street station. It was just wonderful.
Yeah, it's when you have a really well-connected train system of any sort, particularly something along the lines of what we have with Amtrak Cascades along the I-5 corridor, it just makes it so much easier and so much more pleasant to travel in a lot of ways. It keeps it from being a headache. And it does unbelievable things for the region in terms of, the options that you have, and what it does for the economy. And you make a great point there about the travel time, because a lot of people think, oh yeah, well, the plane's always going to be faster. And okay, between given the options right now between Seattle and Spokane, yeah, the plane is usually going to be faster, and there are enough flights that it's pretty convenient. But when we're talking about, particularly connecting a lot of, the other, communities, it is so much, when you're not next to the airport, it is such a hassle to get there, deal with TSA. They tell you to get there 2 hours in advance, so that way, they can sucker you into buying, the overpriced, airport food, all that sort of thing. And we hear about, what's going on with this high-speed rail project in the West, which, we as an organization would absolutely love to see. We think that would be unbelievable. It'd be transformative for the region. But when we're talking about the possibility of improving the Amtrak Cascade service, just by making a few fixes to, a few sections of the route to improve speed, we can cut travel times down to faster than driving, faster than direct, driving, more reliable than driving, and at a fraction of the cost of high-speed rail. So, we believe as an organization, just kind of as an addition to what we're talking about, that we should be talking about how do we improve service on Amtrak Cascades? How do we improve service on East-West, so that way we get the start that we need, creating the system that we need in order to better connect the region within the next 10 years. And you have a question in the back?
Yeah. Just to jump ahead and make Eastern Watch talks about the other states and how they have, increased energy and provided passenger messages. Do you have a projections what thoughts on what we're talking about access in Eastern Washington, what the funding streams are, use for this, and what the type of time
So regarding the first question, and that is something we'll talk about a little bit, we do have some estimated costs for the East-West service according to the most recent study conducted by the consulting firm Steer, which was just completed last year. We understand it's going to be somewhere, according to Steer, it's going to be somewhere along the lines for a line connecting Seattle with Spokane, going twice a day with a morning and an afternoon departure in each direction. We understand that somewhere in the range that is going to be somewhere in the range of about $430 million or so, give or take. And it's important to keep that in perspective, just like Virginia did. You know, we think about how much money we might spend on, you know, improving a couple miles of I-5, you know, in Tacoma, or a couple miles of I-90 in the past, and those prices can easily add up to something along those lines. And for that, we get a statewide corridor. And then, you know, regarding your last question as well. At this point, given where the project is in the planning process, there's still a lot of needs that need to be set up. It still needs to be something that WashDOT takes up as an actual project to officially, you know, work on, you know, to break ground on. So at this point, we don't unfortunately have any timeline for when it would happen. But what we do know is that, you know, compared to what would be required for high-speed rail, for example, where you would be building an entirely new right-of-way, you'd be building new tracks that are elevated, you'd have to buy the land, you'd have to, you know, figure out brand new utilities, you'd have to build brand new stations, you know, that are huge, and, you know, all those sorts of things. High-speed rail, we understand, is going to take no less than 20 years, maybe 30 years, something along those lines, in the I-5 corridor as is currently being discussed kind of on the state level. While, you know, what we understand here is that, yes, there are some track improvements that would need to be made, but when we got the project started, you know, if we, you know, when we actually decide, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to break ground on it, I see no reason why it would take more than just a few years, certainly less than 10 to get everything done. And I think that's just a big, you know.
Big picture is this, you mentioned the Seattle. Do increase basic access for a passenger rail system? What do you
I'm just trying to make sure I understand. So, because what the project I'm referring to is the restoration of passenger rail service along the existing tracks between Seattle and Spokane, serving the communities in the Kittitas Valley and the Yakima Valleys. Just to make sure I understand, you're asking about just general broader improvements? Well, at this point, we need to get that conversation to our legislators, because I don't think that there is a lot of conversation going on about that. I think what we understand is that based on what's going on in Montana, there are efforts to restore passenger rail service along the southern tier of the state. And, you know, so that's kind of going on there. There are more conversations going on in Boise about these things, but we haven't gotten a true plan together for creating an integrated system beyond individual lines. And that's something that we believe is really important, that we go beyond just saying, okay, well, we just want a train line here, we just want a bus line here. We want to be having a broader conversation. And yes, there are projects that exist like the East-West, which should be considered and we should be talking about, but we also want to incorporate them into a broader view of what's going on. This is kind of a short-term vision map for what we have, better connecting the entire state. You know, obviously there are a lot more things to speak of here. If we wanted to build, you know, our dream map, it would include kind of everything that's going on in the whole region, connecting, you know, the entire Pacific Northwest. This is what we just wanted to create as a start of the conversation, you know, of what would a connected Washington look like? Because we know that there are plenty of places that are lacking service altogether right now. And there's just, you know, not very good connections right now. So this is a very short-term vision. This is, I think, the absolute bare minimum that we think would even be acceptable for, you know, really connecting our region. But there are so many opportunities that go well beyond what we could possibly try to illustrate reasonably in this map that we want to talk about and that we want to get your input on. Yes.
So I was wondering, as I asked you before, do you have lobbyists who are going to fight for some of this infrastructure for these?
We have a government affairs director in Olympia, Luis Moscoso, and he We're working on building relationships with more organizations. One thing that we did, for example, yesterday was we spoke with the Greater Spokane Valley Chamber of Commerce. We're reaching out to a lot of other groups across the states. We're trying, I think we will have the mayor of Ritzville and we'll have the mayor of Ellensburg at our meetings in those respective cities. So there's a lot. That's part of, yes, absolutely. And that's another thing I will be covering further on in the presentation. But what it really gets down to is that all of these representatives, on the local level, the county level, like maybe an MPO, the state level and the federal level all talk with each other. And so everybody knows what's going on. Everybody knows what they're hearing from their communities, what they're hearing from their constituents. And that makes an enormous difference in terms of making these things happen. So any conversations you can have with your legislators, with your city council or mayor, with your metropolitan planning organization. I know we've spoken with something called the Yakima County Development Association, over there. And of course, with your state and congressional legislators, any of those conversations you can have and any of those relationships you can build make a difference, because when legislators and representatives hear from you, that makes an enormous difference. Even just talking about passenger rail and talking about how, I want to see some progress over the next few years. I don't only want to be waiting on the next 20 or 30 for high-speed rail. It makes a big difference. It makes an enormous difference, more than I think most people realize. So
And the
that's part
bottom
of what
line is, when you ask, do you have lobbyists? The folks in this room are our lobbyists. And we need your help to communicate what we want to, as Patrick says, the mayors and the city councils and the county people and your state representatives and your national congressional folks. They're going to listen to you because you're their constituents. And they know you are the ones that are going to keep them elected. So it really is, we're trying to give folks a vision and some tools. If you can go to all of these folks and say, this is what we, the community, want.
Yes, sir.
The words, sometimes they will start, once they get down in your mind and talk to you about this stuff. Other representative is always used to volume about.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, that's something that Charlie and I have found, increasingly as we've been having these conversations, that yes, people are coming to us. We are, I think, becoming increasingly a resource for people at different levels, whether it's with Penwar being invited to go to this conference that Charlie and I just did in Montana, or whether it's with our legislators in Washington, D.C., or with other, people in the region like Elaine Flake down in Boise or Dave Strohmeyer over in Montana. We're finding that there are increasing opportunities for collaboration, but that also means that we're getting busier than ever. There's more opportunities than ever, but there's also more work than ever before. So any way that you can help is greatly appreciated. And I'll certainly be talking about that a little bit later on. But I mean, the big three things that we can have help with are volunteering, leadership, and donations. Anything that you can do in kind of those areas, whether that's helping us with event planning like the train track, whether that's reaching out to your local leaders, helping kind of be AWA's liaison to your community, whether that's joining our board of directors, helping us out with fundraising efforts, connecting with Congress people, or whether that is through connecting us with organizations that can help support the work that we do, or whether that's through your personal contributions. Any of those things kind of in that whole area really help us out as an organization.
Are you circulating any petitions?
We don't have any petitions going on right now. We are a 501c3. I don't know if 501c3s have the capacity or the legal ability to circulate a petition.
I don't know. We'd have to look into that. We have very specific goals that we do have, and we're right now developing the goals for 2022 legislative session. So once those are developed, and we're already having conversations with the legislators about that, we will certainly be asking for support for those particular items. And we had a really fantastic conversation with a number of our legislators in the meeting that we just were in Montana, which is a regional meeting, but a number of the folks from Washington State were there. And so I think you will be hearing lots from us. We definitely will want to keep you informed. If you have given us your email address, thank you. You'll be hearing from us. And anything else that you can do to generate more support. We're thrilled to have the support that we're having in the various communities that we're meeting with. We had a nice turnout in Spokane yesterday. This is a great group. Thank you so much. And we're expecting even more in Ritzville today. So, you know, it's every little community helps. And some of it's about the money, but most of it's about the conversations and just making sure that your local representatives are the ones who are hearing from you, that this is, you know, you hear these trains go by every day. Wouldn't it be nice if you could get on one?
One thing that might be useful to see, I was doing it since I was in the 70s. Is this answers the most frequent questions you have back, all the way back to the land grants and the critical year. And
We have some.
That's a good,
And we're building more.
the intricacies, the sort of intricacies of Amtrak County or the Empire Builder paid for Chicago and Seattle and Portland, equal costs, you know, which way they those costs not go away. All the
no, that's a great point, and that's something we're working on our website. And I think that's a great place where we could have some help with volunteering, as well as updating our website, including some good information on these topics. So anywhere that you would want to help with that, absolutely.
You may have been asked this yesterday. Are you in discussion with education council, because I know that they're in the process of for the next session.
And that's the first thing that Charlie and I are going to be working on as soon as we get back home. We've been talking with a few people about that, and yes, we've definitely heard about how SRT. Hold on, I'm just trying to get the SRT. SRTC, yes, that's right. Okay, yes, we're working on, we've been in discussions with a couple people there, and ALWA plans to submit a list of recommended priorities to include passenger rail. We know that the discussions we had with Yakima counties, a kind of equivalent organization, resulted in the inclusion of passenger rail more explicitly in their plans. So definitely we hope that we can do the same for Spokane as well.
It's really important that everybody's reaching out.
We had a nice conversation yesterday with someone who I believe is the vice chair of that committee, and she's very interested in having us participate.
Yeah. So definitely a lot going on there. Again, anything that you can do, whether as a volunteer, a member, a leader, as a director on our board, or as a donor, helps with that. Because you know, Charlie and I have a lot of things that we do, you know, within the organization, and a lot of our volunteers, you know, really, you know, do a ton of work to help with that. And so anything, you know, to help on the ground here in Spokane makes an enormous difference in making sure that we get all of these opportunities, you know, given all of the things that are going on all at once. So that's greatly appreciated. To get back to where I was on the presentation, kind of the last E, and I can make this quick because I think we've already kind of covered it a little bit, is the environment. And there are multiple points to consider here. One is greenhouse gas emissions. We understand that, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that if we want to avoid the worst potential climate damage, we have less than 10 years to act. And by act, that means cut our carbon emissions by about 45% of 2010 levels. And, we all know that when it comes to transportation alternatives and trying to, reduce emissions, that we've been kicking the can down the road for far too long. And, there's so much discussion of the high-speed rail project in the Puget Sound as being a great thing, which would be great. Again, we'd love to see that. We think in the long term that would do a lot of great things, when it comes to reality. But the fact is that the lion's share of our greenhouse gas emissions, the largest emitter is from the transportation section. And within that is automobiles, heavy duty trucks, like the semis that we see, trying to dodge on the road, all those things. So we need to be working on the priorities, and we need to be acting in the short term. By far the best way to do that is to figure out how to make better use of our existing rail system to move not only freight but also passengers. We understand one of our someone that we've been working with as a coalition partner who's worked in transportation research for years told us just the other day that according to his research, the U.S. is 40th in the world for how well it leverages its existing rail system, behind Mozambique. Literally, Mozambique is making better use of the rail system that it has in the United States. And we know that when we look at all of the empty tracks, all of the sections of single tracking that were once double that have been removed, all of the choke points that we have, we know that there are tremendous inefficiencies in what was once the rail network that was the envy of the world. So, and we know that we can make much better use of that to reduce emissions through the better shipping of both freight and passengers.
Simple ones, and maybe one of these on after I'll show you is all the sidings, the siding trains that are about 45 and 45 long. These freights are going, so
So there's tons of wasted capacity because, for tax purposes, a lot of the railroads have decided to take away what was formerly double tracking, and they've gotten rid of routes that they think that cost them a few pennies more taxes than they want to pay. So it's just unbelievable. And there's also an important thing to consider here with the environment, not just in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of various types of pollution. The big one being tire pollution. You might have heard over the past year, according to research from the University of Washington, that a particular compound that is found in tire rubber was determined to be responsible for the mass die-off of coho salmon along a lot of estuaries in Western Washington, along a lot of waterways. So the runoff from pretty much any rubber tired vehicle in a high enough concentration poses a significant threat to native coho salmon. And at this point, we have no alternative to that. We have no other way of getting around that except for trains. Rail is the only form of ground transportation, and I mean, let's even think about air transportation with plane tires, that doesn't contribute to this particular problem. So we need to be thinking, electrifying the cars is going to help with the greenhouse gas emissions, great, but it doesn't fix tire pollution for the salmon. So we need to be considering what we're doing to improve our transportation's environmental impact comprehensively, and not just from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, and not just from an air pollution perspective. So those are our three principles, our three E's: economic development, particularly local economic development and regional economic development, environmental stewardship, and equity, making sure that all communities are connected well, and that our transportation system does not contribute to an undue burden on our environment and on our climate. And we've discussed this in a couple of different places. I wrote a piece for Speedlines, which is a newsletter of the American Public Transportation Association that was published back in May, challenging the high-speed rail project that we hear about to be more equitable, to be more inclusive, and to have some short-term steps that help build up to high-speed rail. You know, again, as an organization, we are not against high-speed rail. We would love to see it. We know that just like what Virginia found, we could probably build high-speed rail for significantly less than building a lane in each direction between Vancouver and Portland. But there's a lot that needs to be considered. There are a lot of existing needs, a lot of communities that are left out, and a lot of existing infrastructure that is not being well utilized. And we need to take short-term action as well as, you know, continue these long-range planning efforts. So we need to be thinking in both spheres, and not just, you know, in the long-term vision for high-speed rail. Exactly. Nail on the head right there, because if you look at, I don't have this slide included with this presentation, but my colleague Abe Zumwalt, who did a lot of the discussion on, and a lot of the, you know, kind of the research into the Virginia side of things for All Aboard Washington, he also found some great information talking about what really happens with high-speed rail, you know, how does it actually come about? And when you look into it, when you examine the 10 most advanced high-speed rail systems in the world, the countries with the most advanced high-speed rail networks in the whole world, in terms of both top speeds and route mileage, you know, the expanse of the network, 9 out of 10 of them started with some sort of conventional rail system already in place. They used, you know, existing conventional rail, whether it was historic or, you know, they made upgrades to their existing network to fuel high-speed rail while the high-speed rail projects were being planned and implemented. This is the case in Japan. Like I said, I studied abroad there for a semester, and Japan had an enormous rail network even before the bullet train, the Shinkansen, was ever built. And it was really only because they were running out of capacity on that network and with conventional rail standards that they had to upgrade to a completely new type of rail system. The same with China, the same with many European countries, even though you know, Europe is known across the world as a leader in high-speed rail. What's really incredible about the European rail network is just the number of local connections you have to that. And, you know, without those local connections, entire swaths of these countries are left off the map and are not connected to the system, and therefore they're unable to benefit from it, and, you know, unable to use it. So, you know, we believe, you know, that as we're having these discussions on high-speed rail, again, much as our organization would like to see it, we need to get our priorities straight. We need to think about all the communities that are along existing tracks, you know, that are in need of services of all sorts, that are in need of being connected to the entire rest of the state and the rest of the Pacific Northwest region. And we think at a bare minimum, it should start with better passenger rail service, including daytime trains through the Yakima and Kittitas valleys. We think it should start with making Amtrak Cascades better, because we know that there's a lot of potential for that service to improve with more frequencies, more departures. We think that there need to be better connections to local transit and intercity bus services, and that we need to add stations along the corridors that are already served, you know, to allow for a mix of local and express services, and to make sure that no community is left off the map, particularly one as important as Cheney with Eastern Washington University. So,
Well, you know, I
yes.
live all around this country, and as you can tell. And my experience of government is that you gotta have money and power to get anything done. And we have see examples of that every day. And so I would like to know who's behind it, who's gonna impact this, who's gonna. Do you have anybody in Washington DC wants this to happen in this country?
There's a group. I'm actually the one of the Washington State representatives to the Rail Passengers Association, which is the national group kind of working on passenger rail issues in Washington DC. And
Where's the money?
And that is an incredibly important part of the conversation that honestly, you know, kind of with you know, me and Charlie still being a little bit new to some of this, we're learning more about. One of the conversations we had with someone who's involved with another group called Transportation for America has talked about having conversations with a lot of the companies that just haven't done the math yet on what it costs them to do transportation in the way that they've done it. One of the examples, the gentleman's name is John Robert Smith, and funny enough, he was the mayor of Meridian, Mississippi when I was born there. I only lived there for 3 years. Both my parents were in the Navy. But yeah, he was the mayor there, and he was working on an Amtrak intermodal station project that has been wildly successful in attracting more money to the city, and in particularly revitalizing Meridian's downtown area. One of the things that he mentioned was that when he talked with a lot of the big companies in Mississippi and along the Gulf Coast, he asked them about, how much do you pay for in parking? How much do you, what sort of costs have you considered with running your own bus service? And what could, passenger rail do to help alleviate those costs? So that's one of the conversations that need to be had. There are a lot of stakeholders, I think, corporate, medium business, and small business that all have some stake in rail, whether that's improving passenger transportation, to improve the access to, like I've mentioned, wineries. We know that there are a lot of people in wineries in Central and Eastern Washington who are interested. We know that there's a lot, to do with other recreation, whether that's parks. We know about the Kraken coming, and there are going to be some games over here in Spokane. We know that there are a lot of stakeholders that have some sort of interest in that. And then, of course, there are the freight stakeholders. One of the things that Representative Matt Benke, who we've talked with, is really working on is the Port of Benton, that there's a new intermodal port facility being built there that's going to have a lot of connections to rail. So that absolutely has to be considered. How are we making the best use of a rail infrastructure to ship goods, particularly over long distances where, trucks cause so much damage and cost so much money, to taxpayers. So there are a lot of stakeholders out there, but to be honest, we're still working to identify them. We're still working to try to build some of these relationships with them, and to show the importance of the work to what we do, for society and, and to help out companies, because there's a lot in this for everybody, really, is what we found. Yes.
I make just a couple minutes of comments. Very interesting listening to this. And I'm very happy to hear some of the local government transportation committee people like the Can Regional Transport being here. In my first life of a working career, I 30 years flying a IDOC all over the state of Washington, the Northwest, country, and then internationally. I racked up 5 million air miles 30 years. And I learned a lot about human nature as well as pressures. The lady speaking about the importance of having the political people get heavily involved couldn't be more correct. And putting the politics aside, which side of the aisle you're on, we have a president that just implemented with some help from our parties a tremendous infrastructure bill, which includes rail, admittedly mostly for the I-95 corridor. But still, now is the perfect time to get people on both sides of the aisle in Washington to feed off that, to get their share, and then hopefully a continued increase at this point in time. As infrastructure is on the table to get that done.
And we do have significant support, as you say, from both sides of the aisle. Of the 10 U.S. House representatives, we have significant support from 9 of them.
Hopefully that can continue.
Yes.
The point is, in my travels, I spent a lot of time in Europe and on the Pacific Rim, and rode some of the trains, like from Paris to London, from Lyon to Paris. And in the Pacific Rim, some of the countries, China is becoming on the leading edge. And we're still, like you said, 40. Human nature is what affects you personally a lot of time.
Yes.
And most people who have their car, it's the irritation of waiting for a train to pass the crossing in Cheney here.
Sure.
After my corporate career, I wanted something else to do. So for the last 6.5 years, I've been a locomotive engineer, a conductor, right here in this area. And safety is one of the biggest concerns that I've learned about. And that's because I handled not only bringing the BNSF trains into 4 Lakes for the loading and unloading, but also handling a 60 to 70 car grain train to Cooley City and back along US Highway 2. US Highway 2 is one of probably the top 3 most deadly highways in the state. And every one of our trains, if it was a 60 car train, that kept 180 18-wheel trucks on the Highway 2.
Mhm.
And then they have to go back empty. So that's 360 trucks if you count both ways.
Mhm.
That, with the high death rate that occurs from people trying to pass trucks on Highway 2 has always struck me as being very important.
Absolutely. Who do
The other
you,
thing is, the amount of freight that can be hauled on a gallon of diesel fuel
Mhm.
is so much more cost effective. All the studies I've seen.
who do you work for?
I'm just retiring now from the Washington Eastern Railroad,
Very nice.
located in Medical Lake.
Great.
It used to be here in Cheney, but they changed hands.
Mhm.
And so I just put my retirement in earlier this week, so
Well,
stepping away from it. But it's so important to try and get people, the average person to understand while they're sitting in that car and griping about waiting for the car to pass. That car came to them probably off the train.
Yep, from a port.
From a ship to begin with.
Yeah.
absolutely.
Fuel in it and everything else, so it just all comes full circle, human nature. We're getting the populations in this state and in the Northwest, Europe and the Pacific Rim has had to deal with for years. So rail has always been important for them. Now, 2020 in hindsight, we're seeing it's gonna be real important here with all of the people trying to move to the Northwest. We lost the perfect light rail corridor years ago from Spokane over to Coeur d'Alene and then up the valley there. You know, maybe you can come back in another fashion.
See, these
Now's the time.
these small rail groups in support of you would be really wonderful.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And if I may suggest, I believe most of you are in Representative McMorris Rogers' district. And whether you agree or disagree with her about other things, she needs to know that her constituents want rail.
Remember when he said 9 out of 10? She's the one. She's the last one that we need to have conversations with. We even broke through to in Southwest Washington. Herrera Butler. We got to her. She's really interested in rail now. She's hearing about what's going on with the Columbia River crossing that bridge between Vancouver and Portland. But McMorris Rogers is the last one. We're working on her though, and anything you can do to talk with her helps us.
We suggest we keep working on it because she and Governor Inslee were both in the grand opening of the Four Lakes grain facility.
Great.
Oh,
It's good to know. Thank
They
you.
were both there together. And they both played a part in making that happen.
Okay.
So if they can work together on that, it would be nice if she would lend a hand on the further advancement.
So,
So thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Take this and read it carefully.
thank you
for
so
joining
much.
us.
We
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Anything you can do to support us, we appreciate it, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's why we're here. We're here for conversation.
First of all, running your representatives to Congress, it's not something that's being pushed really hard by a group like the NRA or something. They can push back against by their opponents. They're just most representatives' offices, if they get 100 letters a month on something, they think they're getting heavy.
Yes.
And also, that's about political support for trains. Historically, for Amtrak, the big support has always been the states along what's called Northeast Corridor, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington. Because anybody who lives there and thinks about it knows that trains quit running, and nobody's going to eat. The highways are instantly be numbered 18 days a day.
Yeah.
And then they got the number elsewhere in the country where they call it top. So they've long had it, they try to, it's really tricky, they go to representatives.
Patrick, may I suggest you skip to the section where we talk about how you can help?
Yeah. So I think we've discussed this very quickly about the East-West project. It's been around for a while. It was first studied in 2001. Unfortunately, due to that car tabs thing that happened, which also wrecked the state's ferry funding system, that kind of put East-West on the back burner. We worked with Central Washington University to collaborate on a marketing study to look at what people were interested in for East-West service. Did they want to see it? Where would they want to go? We found that there was tremendous interest in people wanting to cross the entire state with East-West rail, not just within the Yakima and Cayugas valleys. We brought that to the legislature to conduct a study in 2020, and they found, again, tremendous community support. Pretty good ridership considering the length of the corridor, how long it would take to get from end to end, and the population density of the corridor. The Yakima Valley is the most densely populated corridor on the West Coast right now, with absolutely no passenger rail service. So that's something to consider. The cost, like I mentioned before, less than $500 million, according to Steer, for all the stuff that would be needed to complete this project. And so, I think that leaves a lot of opportunities for other things to do. There were still some weird things about how they considered the study. Like I mentioned, they only factored in people who drove. So they didn't factor in almost 53% of the average train rider in Washington, which is a huge deal. And they made a big deal about slower travel times. The point of East-West service isn't to get from Seattle to Spokane as fast as possible. The point is to better connect communities along the entire route who currently have no options and really no way to feasibly get to anywhere in the middle or anywhere at the ends, wherever that is.
And you'll notice that their map did not include Cheney. We want to add that because obviously it's necessary. And so the study hasn't been done with Cheney included, but that's again something that you folks need to be telling your representatives that you want to work on.
It's probably a good idea too, if you were going to do it.
That's right.
Yes, exactly. And we were hoping to go to Pullman along the trip. Unfortunately, it wasn't able to line up very well with student schedules, with people returning. Charlie and I, kind of as time permits, we plan to do kind of a collegiate train trek, try to visit as many of the colleges, universities across the state as possible, develop student interest, let people know about the possibilities, see if we can, really involve as much of the community as possible and as many of the organizations as possible. We believe that while Cheney is not, yes, we believe that while both for state-supported trains and for the long-distance trains along the route, and kind of going into that, it's feasible. There's still some more work required, and there's a lot of things to consider for the East-West service. When it comes to a Cheney stop specifically, we're still trying to learn exactly how this works, but what we understand, according to a conversation we had with the head of the Rail Freight and Ports Division at WashDOT, is that Washington State has a station stop policy for the Amtrak Cascade service, which also...
Yeah, your slides are not forwarding.
Okay.
We had this problem yesterday. There's some technical issues going on.
So I'll just make sure I'm restarted with Zoom.
Yeah.
All right. There we go. All right. So there. When we're considering the possibility of adding
Share
a
your
station
screen.
stop, whether that is, I did. Is it not liking this one?
No.
The struggles of technology. Is that it?
Okay, it's on.
That now? Okay, there we go. Thank you for your patience. So when we're talking about the possibility of adding in a new station stop, there are a lot of things to consider. WashDOT a station stop policy guide for the Amtrak Cascades corridor. When I talked with Ron Pate about this as well, the guy at WashDOT, about whether or not this applies outside of the Amtrak Cascades corridor, he told me that it does. So there are a number of considerations that need to be thought of. First of all, is that usually there's an expectation that the local communities provide some of the funding upfront, but that the state typically bears the brunt of the cost. So that's why WashDOT doesn't like adding new stops to places, because they're the ones that have to pay for it a lot of the times, and that's why they really want to see very strong community support. And ideally some sort of community contribution to show that there's some splitting the cost, that everyone's got skin in the game. There's also a couple of criteria that have to be met for any station that's added along any of the existing train routes. Typically, it has to be that it causes no delay to the schedule, that the end time, the run time of the route is the same as it was before, meaning that there often have to be track improvements that are made to decrease the times to the schedule. And they also have to demonstrate that there would be strong ridership. I think that Cheney is an excellent example of, by having a university and by having more than just one train a day in the middle of the night, but, expanding service, that there's a lot of potential for Cheney to act as a great infill station, because it'll be connecting Eastern Washington University with literally the rest of the state. And like I mentioned, so we understand, when I read through the document, it was referring specifically to Amtrak Cascades. The fact that it's written by Washington State DOT and Oregon DOT, to me suggests that they're talking really about the Amtrak Cascades corridor, and they've really written this policy in order to try to I guess make it harder for Blaine to get a station, or to make Blaine, really participate in the process of improving tracks and stuff like that. But I was told that it also applies state, so that's something we still need to get more information on. But this is something to consider, and you can find it on WashDOT's website. I'd be happy to send a link to anyone who wants to take a look at it, or if you just search Washington Station Stop Policy Guide, you can find information about it and download the document from WashDOT's website to learn more. And that's definitely going to involve, to get a station, you need to have local involvement in that. So lots of things we've talked about here. There's lots of needs to restore service, including to Northwest Washington. The trains are still not, the Amtrak Cascades trains are still not running north of Seattle. And the daily Empire Builder between Seattle and Spokane only goes as far as Everett before heading east. So that means Stanwood, Mount Vernon, and Bellingham have all been cut off from the network, and and pretty much, so that means the entirety of Skagit and Whatcom counties. So we want to fight to restore service there, although that's going to depend on the reopening of the border. We want to increase the frequency of Amtrak Cascades, because we recognize that it's at a really critical tipping point where if it gets just a few more trains, it will be just frequent enough to enable really easy I-5 corridor travel, connecting in with all the other transportation services that would allow it to break 1 million riders per year in annual ridership. Yes. Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
I seem to recall several years in California, there was a frequency on state routes. All of a sudden, ridership pay up, say, well, if I miss one,
That's right.
Exactly.
And that's what that chart shows. Okay.
That's exactly what my colleague Abe Zumwalt found, was when he did an analysis, a regression of the Amtrak state-supported services, that at the point of 6 to 8 frequencies per day, and this is in various sorts of corridors, some that are a little more rural, some that are a little bit more urban. Once you hit between 6 to 8 frequencies a day, ridership explodes, because suddenly, rather than having to check the schedule, rather than having to look at the map, and rather than worrying about missing your last train and choosing not to ride because you might be worried about that, you have enough flexibility that you can kind of show up at the station, and within a reasonable amount of time it'll be there. If you need to stay, an extra hour or two wherever you're at, oh, no worries, there's going to be another train a little bit later, I'll be just fine, that sort of thing. So it makes it possible to ride the service without having any of the worries associated with kind of schedule anxiety, that sort of thing. We think about range anxiety with electric cars. Am I going to have enough battery to get to the end and have a charging point? With trains, it's schedule anxiety. Am I going to have a train that's early enough or late enough, that's on time enough for me to make the meeting, or to make my family event, or whatever that might be.
And when the study for East-West was done in 2020, they only did a study for 1 or 2 trains a day. We think that they should looked at more, because for exactly the reasons Patrick just said, if East-West is going to be successful, you need more frequency than 1 or 2 trains a day. And so that would be important to Cheney, because obviously the students are going to want to go at all sorts of different hours. And so it, you know, 1 or 2 trains a day, well, that's a good start. But it's going to need more than that in order to really be successful.
So, you know, that's a big thing. And so as we're talking, whether we're talking about Amtrak Cascades or really any of the services in the region, including the Empire Builder, including the potential for east-west service, we think that more frequencies should be looked at because the data shows providing more frequencies, particularly kind of that magic area of 6 to 8 a day, does a ton for things. Just as an anecdotal example, my parents lived in the west of Ireland for about a year in a town called Westport in County Mayo, about 3.5 hours or so west of Dublin. And despite the fact that Dublin or Ireland is one of the least densely populated countries in the entire European Union, despite the fact that Mayo is a relatively rural, you know, mostly agricultural county in the western part of the country, an hour away from the nearest major city, Westport still got 9 trains a day to Dublin. I think that pretty much proves it right there.
Well, historically, the day before Amtrak started, there were 4 trains a day from Spokane to Seattle. And I can't remember for sure, but 2 or 3 that we record.
I believe so, yeah.
What if we started there?
Yes.
Now we recognize that there would be some challenges of extending the existing trains because the route that the existing Empire Builder uses, both of them, the one to Portland as well as the one to Seattle, are the 2 busiest east-west routes in the state. The route that we're talking about expanding passenger rail service on is a lot less busy. The tunnel on that route, what's called the Stampede Pass route, is not quite tall enough to serve double-stacked freight cars. So all of that freight has to go either along the Columbia River or along Stevens Pass. Stevens Pass is a little bit of a shallower mountain route. It's not as steep as Stevens Pass. So what the railroad does is they run empty freight cars that are like the coal cars or the oil cars across Stampede Pass, the route that we're talking about through Yakima and Kittitas Valley. And they run the full ones across Stevens Pass or along the Columbia River.
Meeting the needs here. I mean, Stampede closed 20 years.
Yes. Exactly. And
We also have their close in Stampede. But we have from near Spokane all the way down to Pasco, there's the old Spokane. We also have
which was mostly torn up, unfortunately. Yeah.
Also, it's built also superior series.
Yeah. So there are a lot of
We're looking at relieving stress.
Well, and that's why our vision map is about the short-term, low-hanging fruit that we can get using the existing routes. I think all of us would love to see bringing back services in some of the places that you're talking about. But we all know that that's going to be a longer.
There's a problem on Stevens Path.
You have an alternative. Resilience.
Yeah.
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 Yes.
So there are a couple of things that are pretty exciting in DC right now. As you probably know, the infrastructure bill has significant amount of money for rail, specifically for capital. They have 3 or 4 different grant programs that they are creating that some of them existed before, some of them are new. And there will be the opportunity to get funding for such projects that just have not been available before. Even because it's still in Congress, we don't know the exact amount that's going to be available, but it's significantly more than we've ever seen in many, many years. So that's one. The other is that there is a subpiece of that is that there's an item in the bill that says 20% of that money needs to be set aside for rural and underserved communities. And, you know, this part of the world is all about that. And so there is money to be had. Now, some of it would have to be matched, but again, we don't know the details yet because it's still in Congress. Yes.
Yes.
It would include that too.
There is. Well, one of the things that's been discussed, and there isn't a formal, it's something that's been talked about for a while, and it's kind of gone on and off. And it's something that the Rail Passengers Association has been very supportive of the entire time, is the creation of an intercity or just a passenger rail trust fund of some sort, which would provide a stable source of funding. I'm not. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And we know.
Yeah. Well, there's something, the trust fund includes something like that, okay? Yeah, correct. The other thing also is on the local level, there's some interesting things that are available. There's the possibility of creating what's called a rail district. And what it is it's a county level thing. That it's like a port district or a public facilities district where you can create one of these, and then the community, gets a percentage of the state sales tax that then can go toward increasing the rail facilities.
Also going on is there's that particular municipal like rail. After Portland reinvented other cities looking at it. A lot of them, people, all costs. Tears down. We'll just build it single track. We won't build it as long. We won't buy as much equipment as we were planning. And then
Thank you so much.
It's like an impression of people hanging out the windows.
Mm-hmm.
And there was suddenly, oh my God, we need more.
Yeah.
There was a sudden support for it once people had access to it and saw that, oh, this is something.
And this relates to the problem that we have right now. One of the big needs across the entire country for better train equipment and more of it. Because right now, one of the things that few people talk about is that there is a tremendous equipment shortage across the US and Canada. And it's not something that you can go to your local train car dealer and buy off the lot. You have to have negotiations with manufacturers several years in advance most of the time. A lot of times it has to meet Buy America requirements, which is great for American labor, but it also means that there are a lot of times delays in getting the equipment. It's something you have to start early. Most of these manufacturers have to build a factory somewhere in the United States. They have to source components from new manufacturers and build the components to specific American requirements, which are sometimes a little bit different.
Yes.
There are some American manufacturers. I'm trying to think, there's one in Pennsylvania that I know makes a lot of streetcars. Was it Brookville?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think.
But
There have been a couple of manufacturers that got.
when you're talking about trains, there are a couple. All right. However, as Patrick is about to tell you, there is they've just signed a contract with Siemens in Sacramento to build a train, a bunch of new train equipment for the entire country. And we are in line to get some of that. So that's going to be 3 or 4 years at least down the road, but it's coming. And if you've been on the Empire Builder recently, you know that the equipment that they have was built in 1980, and it's hanging in there. But it's been a while.
On the whole, the equipment, the average equipment age in the US is somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 years, sometimes older, sometimes a bit newer. But the bottom line is that despite that, we don't have a lot of newer equipment, and it's in the pipeline now. A lot of it is being built in California at Siemens factory just south of Sacramento, but we've got to wait for that. And so in the meantime, we have to be thinking, while we're waiting for this equipment, we need to figure out how to make the best use of the equipment that we've got and really have a plan together for what we're going to do, how we're going to create a long-range passenger rail network, so that way we can approach the companies and say, hey, we're going to need X number of trains, instead of, okay, an order here, an order there, and then maybe we have to wait a couple more years because there are a couple of orders ahead of ours, things like that. So, I mean, that's all really critical.
All of the online companies build passenger cars. They're not business, they're making it out of that.
Mhm.
And because there isn't a steady enough, I mean, it's like some cars, major Amtrak's route, board administration, they see like slow days for the Western routes, cars registration. And other little bits to realize there hasn't been a steady market. It hasn't like Amtrak's replaced 1% of our cars every year.
Mhm.
And the most city transits is big enough to have
So we need to create a critical mass. We have to have a vision for making better use of our rail infrastructure and having kind of a coexistent plan of enough equipment to serve all of that, and a steady, not only a less, politicized process, but a really steady process that actually makes sure that there's enough of a market to justify, the sort of rail car manufacturing lines that are needed to have the capacity. So it's a very difficult problem, but that's one we're working on. And kind of as we start to solve that, then we also need to be tackling this network problem, making sure that we're not just building a high-speed rail line, from Vancouver to Eugene, that we're factoring in all the things that can be done. By the way, this is kind of a dirty little secret. I love the people at Cascadia Rail. I work closely with one of the colleagues there. She presented in one of the local news things. Unfortunately, none of these routes are actually being considered at this time to Spokane for high-speed rail. Those are only existing rail corridors. Those are all the existing rail corridors going east-west. And it would be great if they could be upgraded to high-speed rail standards, but in terms of actually building what is referred to as high-speed rail, it's simply not there. And it's something that, is not being considered formally as a part of the proposal that is in place right now by Governor Inslee and by WashDOT for high-speed rail. So we need to be talking about how we can improve service along those lines, how we can connect those communities realistically. And I would love to see high-speed rail get there one day, but we know it's going to take time, and we need to be talking about short-term actions, that help, build up progress, build up momentum, and build up connectivity. Part of that for the east-west service, this particularly, the Seattle to Spokane route that we're speaking of through the Yakima Valley, the next two steps that it needs in order to be eligible for federal funding are a cost-benefit analysis, which examines, all of the cost of the service as well as the potential benefits. What are the impacts on emissions? What are the impacts on safety? What are the impacts on vehicle miles traveled, which the state has goals to reduce over the course of the next decade? Things like that. As well as an economic analysis. This is also required for federal grants, to understand what's going to happen to local tax revenues, what's going to happen to local jobs, what's going to happen to quality of life, property values, all these impacts that have an economic sort of component on communities. So both of those, once those are done, will help make the project eligible for federal funding. And those are sort of the next steps that we are working on at All Aboard. No worries. It's been a great conversation today. Thanks for participating. Yeah. Cool.
What's your source of match?
Again, we don't know yet because it hasn't been finalized. We know there will be a match, and it will then be up to us to work with the legislature to figure out how to do that.
We understand that part of the local match can actually come in kind. So that would include, for example, if there's any public or private ownership of the stations and there's an agreement to use the station as part of that, it's great. Although there's also other considerations, like we would have to rebuild a lot of the platforms on existing stations in order to be compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Well, that's certainly one source. I mean, it will be up to the legislature to decide where it comes from in the budget. And again, as Patrick said, it can be.
Federal DOT. Yeah, okay. Yeah, because the federal DOT requires usually a local or state match for that, right?
Yes. And again, it doesn't have, as Patrick said, it can be in kind. It can even be things like marketing. It doesn't actually have to be cash. And I mean, frankly, we think one of the interesting proposals that's in the infrastructure bill is that one of the grants would include funding for operations for the first, I believe it's 66 years.
Starting out with a 90% contribution for the first 3 years and then gradually phasing down to 30% by the 6th year.
And so what that would allow, would be for the local communities to work out how they're going to pay for it in the long term. And it would also give them a good idea of how much support there is, how much fare box revenue they can expect to get, and so on. So it's not like you're committing yourself to a long-term dollar contribution right away. And as I said, this hasn't been finalized yet, but it looks to us, particularly for those of us in smaller communities, that that's probably a good way to go.
And we'd be happy to have some discussions with you about this because, we're connecting with, I think further, into the long term because we're connecting with more representatives, on the state level. We're connecting with more people kind of in the regional level. To help with that, and to try to answer some of those questions. And I think, bringing as many people to the table as possible with different ideas is great. I know there've been a lot of things discussed about, and this is a little bit controversial, but the idea of potentially tax increment financing, for rail projects, which I know has kind of historically been excluded in the state. What that would mean is essentially where you can come up with agreements, sometimes typically with private companies of some sorts to have deals whereby for, stuff related to taxes or related to businesses, you can cooperate with private entities for funding projects. This is something that's common in Japan, for example, where a lot of times, and I think also in Hong Kong, where you create agreements to share the space around stations with businesses, and there's a small tax that's placed on those businesses that operate around there. So people who use the train, who use those businesses, like let's say a convenience store, a restaurant, a department store, things like that, that revenue actually contributes to the transit line, whether that's for operations or capital. Things like that. And that's something which for rail and highway projects in the US has often been controversial, but the bottom line is that it often takes a lot off of the taxpayer because then it's businesses and riders who are helping to fund the system rather than just the state as a whole.
And this is another where it doesn't hurt that the chairman of the Senate Transportation Committee is our Senator Maria Cantwell. And so, this is the sort of thing that we, as a group, need to be talking to Senator Cantwell about, here are the issues, this is what we want, She's been supportive. But again, anytime, you feel the need to communicate with her, she'll want to know that. Her staff will want to know that. So, that's another thing that you can do. We have in this state, we have some pretty powerful people in both the Senate and the House who are into transportation. I don't believe McMorris Rogers is on the Transportation Committee, but 3 of the representatives are on the House Transportation Committee from the West Side. So, we've been talking to them. We've been talking to Representative Strickland, who is the vice chair of the subcommittee on railroads. Okay, so that's a good thing. And our friends in Oregon talked to Representative DeFazio, who is the House Transportation Chair. And so, they want to hear from us. They want to know what's important. And when we talk to them, we do have people who will be listening.
In the interest of time, I'm just gonna point to the presentation so we can finish having the discussion, because there's so much to talk about here, and we're so glad to hear of all of your engagement, all of your ideas, and all of your just interest in wanting to help with this. The last thing, and we think that this is going to be really crucial, especially here in Spokane and Cheney, is having a passenger rail opinion group. There's a couple of interesting things with the ferry system that give them a huge advantage in terms of their ability to influence policy in Olympia and meet their needs, have their constituents' voices heard. And probably the biggest one, or at least one of the biggest ones, is that they have something called the Ferry Riders Opinion Group, the frog ribbit. It allows ferry riders to have a direct voice, a direct connection to the Washington State Transportation Commission, which then makes policy advice, recommendations for WashDOT. And we know the ferry, that ferry riders and ferry users have a big voice in Olympia. One example is that if you go to your local county auditor's office to pay for your car tabs, your $8 fee that you pay on top of that actually goes to support the state ferry system. The state ferry system is considered a part of the state highway system because of some little finagling that was able to be done in the past. But that also leads to a lot of weird complications with how the ferry is funded, and what goes on with that. And because of the influence of ferry riders.
That's right.
But passenger rail riders and intercity bus riders, and I think even just transit riders in general, don't really have much of a voice. We believe that there should be a passenger rail opinion group or a train riders opinion group created to the Transportation Commission, so that way we hear more direct feedback from constituents who ride rail, whether that's because of the frustration of trains being 5 hours late coming, from Chicago, or them showing up in the middle of the night, or there being only a single train that you can ride at any time of the day whatsoever. Having a direct group where you can express your voice to the Transportation Commission will help. And the Transportation Commission is extremely interested in passenger rail, a lot more so than what we've seen on the legislative level and on the WashDOT level. The Transportation Commission wants to find solutions, and in fact used to be a lot more involved with issues in the past, and they simply don't hear from a lot of things, I think, because of this problem with no passenger rail group. So we think that that's going to be important. So those kind of synthesizing those into our top priorities over the course of the next year. We want those next steps for East West Trains to happen to improve funding eligibility for those new federal grants, particularly considering that they're going to be looking more at serving underserved communities, and particularly corridors that connect two of any of the 100 largest metropolitan statistical areas in the country. Guess what? As of 2020 census, Spokane is number 99. So that means a corridor connecting Spokane with Portland or Boise or Seattle would make it eligible and much more competitive under new federal grant opportunities, as well as considering all of the communities in the middle that are underserved and that don't have access to service right now. So but it's there. The rails exist, and with the long distance rail restoration projects going on, City Council President Boyce, Elaine Clegg in Boise is really interested in and talking about with us and with Dave in Montana. We think that there's some potential there. And we think that there's some really it's just a few miles of tracks that you need to do when you talk, Auburn to the Tri-Cities, Tri-Cities to Hermiston, Oregon. You could possibly even do some stuff with the tracks existing, going to Walla Walla and Dayton. There's not a whole lot of infrastructure that needs to be repaired, in order to get some of the basic services operating. So we think by having the benefit cost analysis and the economic impact analysis, we will be ready for when the funds are dispersed, and we'll be ready to help advance these projects that help our communities. Then, of course, we're fighting to try to restore and expand Amtrak Cascade service to get it over that 1 million rider mark. And we think that at about 6 to 8 round trips a day, that's where it starts making sense to go, okay, how do we connect East Washington into the system? How do we connect Central Washington and make the best use of that, so that way there's connected transportation across the corridor. We think 6 to 8 trips a day on Cascades is enough to help expand the network beyond that. And finally, creating that passenger rail opinion group. So finally, what can you do? There's lots of things we can do. We've been talking about a lot of it. You see, it's a big conversation. It's really exciting. There's so much going on, and it's confusing. We're learning about things all the time that make it clear that there's a lot to juggle. But there are really 3 big things that you can do to help. The first is awareness. Tell people about the project. The biggest thing that we found when we've talked with anybody is that people simply don't know that there is a project underway to potentially restore service between Spokane and Seattle. A lot of people don't talk about it. A lot of people don't know it exists. But as anybody who about it support it, we've tremendous support across the entire state from people who know. So it starts with talking with your friends and family about just how frustrated you are with our existing transportation system, just how much you want to have better options for getting anywhere, whether that's with this east-west project or with any sort of rail project. Talk about whether you used to ride the train or whether you just want to see a better option. Talking about those with your friends and your family is crucial just to spreading the awareness. Then, of course, there's talking about it with your representatives, whether that's on the local level, your city or your county, whether that's on the state level with your legislators, whether that's on the regional level with an NPO, or whether that's with your Congress people. Talking with your representatives, your elected and otherwise, lets people know that you want to know about this. And everybody, like I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, everybody talks with each other. Everybody knows about what projects are on the minds of their constituents. So the more that you talk about it, the more that you raise the awareness, and the more that you bring it to the people who are representing you and who are working hard to find solutions for these sorts of issues, the more that they're going to be likely to support it. When we have meetings with people in DC, Charlie will tell you, there's always asking about, well, what's the governor think about it? What do the legislators think about it? What does the county commission think about it? All those things. And the same at the local level. What do our senators think about it? What do our representatives think about it? What do the legislators in Olympia think about it? So it's this complex thing of everybody asking what everyone's thinking about it, which is why we need to be talking with kind of everybody at the same time. And that's hard, but the more of these conversations we have, the more the collective awareness of this comes about, and the more open-minded people come to be about these solutions. So that is a really critical, important thing. And there's a lot of ways we can talk about it. I think, the ways that really hit home are that we need to get our priorities straight. We can't be doing things the way they've always been done, because look at where we're at. Look at where we're at with highway expenditures and with inequity, with safety, all these things. We need to be emphasizing equity for urban and rural communities. We need to be emphasizing local and regional economic development, finding better ways for us to appreciate our own region, rather than, looking about going outside. And finally, the environment. Good stewards to the environment. This amazing place that we have here in the Pacific Northwest, figuring out how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, tire pollution, air pollution, all these sorts of things. Really emphasizing accessibility and interconnectivity, not just making it fast to go places, but making it easy for anybody, whether you're able-bodied or not, whether you have a good paying job or not, to get places, and making sure that it's not a pain to do so, making sure that there are good connections between modes. Focusing on the need for prudent short-term action. Yeah, love to see high-speed rail one day, but we have rails right now that are not being very well used opportunities today. Why don't we take advantage of them? Why don't we use them over the next 10 years to help with climate change, to help with our aging population, to help with all of these issues of economics that are going on? And finally, better east-west passenger rail and Amtrak cascades are beneficial to all of these, and they're beneficial to the entire region. They cost a lot less money than trying to do more things with the highways. We can provide a lot better service to a lot more places, even if it isn't always the fastest way to get from A to B. Sometimes it is, though, when you factor in all the points we were talking about with the airport, or all those sorts of things. It's really important. And finally, grassroots advocacy. We're one of a very small group of organizations and a really small group of people who are actually doing this sort of work. And it's been around for a while, and it's been a struggle because a lot of things have been against us, but there's now so much more that is coming about. There's so many more conversations, and people are realizing that rail is a good solution. And connecting rail in, not just with other trains, but with our broader transportation system and our society is crucial. And I mean the presence of rail in this bill, the greater support for rail than ever before, is a testament to that. And our work isn't possible without you. And there's a lot that you can do if you're interested in trying to promote better connected transportation services across the Northwest. A lot of things that you can do to help. The first is volunteering. We need a lot of help with community outreach. We need a lot of help with content writing, whether that's helping us kind of refine things on our website, whether that's writing stuff for our newsletter, or whether that is helping us make posts on social media. I'm the newsletter editor. We have a quarterly newsletter that goes out to our members digitally and in print, and that takes a lot of time when we're especially when we're working to do a lot of these meetings across the region. So we need help there. Event planning, of course. We're trying to do more of that. It was hard over the past year because of the pandemic, but we're trying to do as many events as we can, whether formally or informally, to know people and to hear people's priorities. So we need help there. Leadership. We need more fundraising capacity. That is a very big challenge for us right now, and it's a big challenge for a lot of passenger rail advocacy groups. So as a board member, you can help us with that, whether that's through your personal donations or whether us to organizations or the local business community, whoever you might know who has a stake in this and who wants to make things better and to make that possible. Organizational policy. I read a lot of the policy positions along with Charlie and others, to show people what are we thinking, what do we think is better, how do we want to approach these problems. Government relations. We do have a government affairs director in Olympia, but our volunteers and our leaders, our board members, are active in having these conversations, building these relationships, doing the networking, whether on the local level or on the state level or the national level, to make it happen. And yes, donations, anything that you can do to make sure that I have enough coffee to make it over the mountains is greatly appreciated. Thank you. And this is our fundraising goal for our train trek. So anything you can do, whether through your own personal contributions or, like I mentioned, connecting us with other partners who want to share in these conversations and make things happen, is crucial.
And we take credit cards.
Yes, we've got credit cards. So yeah, we've gone through a lot of these points already, hearing about some of the challenges and how, we can better address them, what we can consider as an organization. There's still so much more to talk about. We want to build better connections with our universities, hospitality industry, all these things. Yes. I think we're pretty close to the end. Yeah, so I'll put up the map. Let's. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
That's a great, and it is, yeah, and there's a lot of
Yeah, it's actually
Yeah.
one item on our website. If for no other reason that you may remember in 2017, the derailment in DuPont, two of our board members died in that accident, and we're still working on their behalf.
It's a lot of what we can evaluate.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is a great point, because passenger rail is a tremendously safe method of travel on the whole. You know, there was an amazing statistic I heard of, I mean, really, no, shocking, I mean, terrible statistic I heard the other day talking about what, you know, car dependency is doing to our society, from one of the companies that's kind of working with like autonomous vehicles. What he said was that when we factor in, you know, all of the deaths associated with our car dependence, what, you know, through air pollution, all that is, you know, air pollution, things like that. It's like the equivalent of Boeing 737 falling out of the sky 5 days a week, every week of the year, which I just found to be shocking. I mean, when you put it in that perspective, and you know, that has a real impact on people all across our country. And you know, what, like Charlie said, you know, our personal connection with, you know, the accident that happened in DuPont, you know, is certainly something that's always on our minds. But you know, with our work, you know, one of the big things that, you know, that keeps us going is that we understand that that is something that is so rare that happened, you know, and you know, it's something that, you know, continuously is being worked on, that you know, on the whole, that doesn't change our view of trains as a safe mode of transportation. When you look at the statistics, you know, you think about the millions of people who ride the trains each year, it makes the news when there's an accident. Car accidents that kill people, you know, in our state, in our region, don't make the news because it's just a daily occurrence. And you're right.
Oh, absolutely.
And you're right. There's still people who, you know, talk about, you know, having seen the train accident and being afraid of trains because of that, even though, you know, even though, yeah. And even though, you know, on the whole, you know, all of the issues that have been, you know, that were discovered as a result of that accident have been addressed. There's increasing use of train control systems that prevent overspeeding into curves. You know, there's better analysis of training practices, signage. All of those factors that had a play in the accident are being addressed, and every day our railways are getting safer. And we believe it is a safe way to travel.
Isn't the railroad system in this country subsidized by the federal government?
Oh yes, when it comes to passenger, absolutely, and when it comes to the freights as well, there are definitely various contributions that come into that. So I mean, and that gets to our point about when we're talking about transportation in our society, it always comes up, oh well, why don't the trains pay for themselves? Didn't they used to? And that's a legacy of the private railway industries. They were built by private companies. But the bottom line is that transportation, you know, our current you know, society and transportation, everything, providing access always requires some sort of government involvement. There's almost always some sort of contribution that has to be made.
That's right. And there's no
Exactly.
form of transportation that isn't subsidized one way or the other. Okay.
Studies show that the system as a whole has not made a profit for
It's absolutely necessary.
Exactly.
I want to thank you guys. I want to
Thank-
thank Patrick and Charlie. You're very excellent.
Thank you so
I
much.
was hoping that I could get a copy of your PowerPoint.
Yes, it'll
Absolutely.
be on tomorrow.
Okay, to utilize it in writing letters, but I appreciate all the work you're doing.
And anything you want to do when it comes to talking with your local officials, please let us know. We've been working on doing more research, you know, and coming up with good materials to share with more communities. Like I can't praise my colleague Abe Zumwalt enough. He's a really good data guy. He works for RL Banks, which is a rail-focused consulting firm out of the Washington, D.C. area. And he has a lot of amazing information on what trains do for our society, how they help people, and how trains fit into our wider transportation system. So anything at all that you want, anything that you want to learn, anything that we can do to help you have these conversations in your communities with your officials, please let us know. Give us a call, send us an email. I will admit, I'm not the best with email. I have a very busy inbox, but if you call the number on our business cards, let me look at my business cards really quick, but I moved the ones from there out of, I'll be right back.
Sorry, what was your name again? Let me make Molly. Okay. Let me make sure I'll send you the link when it goes up. Okay. Yes. Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it.
Other modes are subsidies better than
I hope you found it helpful.
My granddad left a big lobby thing.
Yes, I know, but it starts at the bottom.
airlines and the bus companies and such are much better.
No, it's not. This was intended to show the difference between what exists now and what would exist. And everybody asked that question, and we're gonna have to go back to our artists and say, we gotta do a better job of that. But no, it would actually be on the same line as what the Portland section of the builder does now. But yeah, we said, well, we want to show it that it's a separate service, but I think that confuses. Turns out it's confusing people. Yes. Yeah. But that's
So
that was just intended to show that it would be.
Here we go. Yeah.
And if you,
Yeah. So thank you very much. Yeah, happy. If you want, I'm a little easier to reach by phone, usually by call or text. So I can put my number there, but the all aboard Washington phone number here will also go through. I think, or you can send me an email. I'd be happy to pass on my number there.
If you'd be interested, we'd be happy to get it. Oh, great. Yes.
And yeah, we can do for you. Just let us know. We're working on a lot of different things, but we're happy to be here to help you.
And there'll be a link that says support. So thank you so much. We appreciate your coming. Oh, wait, I gotta talk back to it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming. It's a good idea. We'll work on that. Yeah, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Oh, cool.